Before we jump into the sermon, I just want to take a moment. I just feel led to take a moment and just say a word of thanks to these scouts. Samuel, you did such a great job, and all of the scouts ushering, greeting. Haven't they done a great job this morning? Let's say thanks to them. Let's bow together, shall we? Our gracious and loving God, now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts together be acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our everlasting Redeemer. Amen. As you know, we've been involved in this series of sermons, Enemies of the Spirit, and for the last several weeks we've been talking about how God desires for each one of us to have peace and joy and contentment in our life. And so we've been looking at some of the enemies of those things. And this morning we turn to one that I think at one point or another plagues most, if not every single one of us, and that is the enemy of worry. So in preparation for this morning, I just started thinking about my own life a little bit. I started thinking about some of the things that I've worried about over the years. I thought about things that I worried about as a child or as a young person. I was interested when Jenna was having her children's moment to listen to what the kids had to say. They didn't say much, but they kind of connected with me. I worried about my grades. I worried about what other kids at school thought about me. And I remember I worried about a guy by the name of Tiny. Now, you might not think that Tiny, based on his name, would be anything to worry about. But Tiny's name wasn't actually representative of Tiny's size. To kind of get a real picture of Tiny's size, you need to think of Dwayne Johnson, the actor who's better known as The Rock. That's kind of what he was like. And not only that, but Tiny's name wasn't really Tiny. I think it was something like Sue. But as the old song tells you, everybody knew better than to call him that. Tiny got his name because he was the biggest and the meanest kid in school. And you might find this hard to believe, but I actually used to be a lot smaller than I am right now. And Tiny didn't like me very much. And in fact, come to think of it, I don't think Tiny liked anybody very much. And so I just kind of worried a little bit about Tiny. And I started thinking about later, after Carol and I married and we had kids, what were some of the things I worried about then? Well, I worried about the kids. I worried about when the kids were excessively nice to me, because that usually meant it was going to cost me something. I worried about whether or not I was the kind of parent they needed, whether or not I was providing them the sort of opportunities they need, whether or not I was providing the kind of moral, ethical, and spiritual compass they would need so that they would have the proper foundation when the time came to step out on their own. And then I started thinking about some of the things that I worry about today. Now, if you were to ask my wife, Carol, she would tell you that I worry about everything. That's not true. I can't think of a single time when I have worried about mowing the grass or taking out the garbage. But there are some things that I do worry about. I worry about preparing sermons on worry. And I worry about how the church is doing. And I worry about my family. And sometimes I worry about my health. I think most of you know this, maybe not all of you, but last week I was out. I had a little bit of surgery. It was nothing major, but it was very highly technical, and it involved being under general anesthesia for a few hours. And I've never had any kind of surgery before. And so as the nurse was wheeling me down the hallway towards the operating room, she wanted to kind of prepare me. She wanted to try and put my mind at ease a little bit. And so she said, now, when we get to the operating room, it's going to be a little bit overwhelming. There are going to be a lot of machines in there, and there are going to be a lot of people in there. And about that time, as they were wheeling the gurney down, just on the other side of the wall of the hallway that we were on, they were doing some construction. And she said, don't worry about any of that noise. They're just preparing for your surgery right now. And so I kind of worried about that a little bit. Well, later, as I reflected on all of these different things, you know what occurred to me? It occurred to me that virtually everything I worry about is a projection into the future. I get anxious about the things that have not yet happened, which is sort of a definition of worry, isn't it? What are some of the things that you worry about? And I ask that because worry is really sort of a universal deal, isn't it? According to the National Institute of Mental Health, every year, approximately 40 million adults in the United States are affected by anxiety. So what are some of the things that you worry about? Maybe it's your children. Maybe it's your grandchildren. Maybe it's whether or not you succeed at work or succeed in some field. Maybe it's something bigger. Maybe it's terrorism. Or maybe it's sending your kids off to school. That's kind of become a big one, hasn't it? Or maybe you worry that the economy might turn south. Have you thought about what you worry about? Well, the moment you think about it, just hold it in your mind for a second. Because you know what Jesus tells us? Jesus tells us that we're not to worry. That day on the Mount of Beatitudes, as he sat and he taught his disciples, Jesus was looking into the eyes of people who are a lot like you and me. They may have lived in a different culture. They may have faced a different world situation. They may have spoken a different language, but many of their worries were exactly the same as ours. They worried about making a living and caring for their children and outbreaks of violence and other things like that. And so as Jesus looked into their eyes, he said to them, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life." Now when Jesus said that to them, he was not trying to add to their burden. He wasn't saying, you shouldn't feel this way. He wasn't saying, you shouldn't feel worry. Have you ever noticed how people sometimes do that to you? Sometimes you'll be feeling bad about something and someone will come along and they want to try and help. And so they start telling you all of the reasons that you shouldn't feel the way you feel. And they mean well, but instead of making the load lighter, they actually add to the burden. Because now you have to feel bad about the fact that you feel bad. Well, that's not what Jesus was doing here. Neither was Jesus offering some pious platitudes. He was not simply being shallow. A few years ago, you may recall that Bobby McFerrin released a song that kind of caught on, not just here in this country, but all over the world. It had a very catchy tune, and it was one of the songs that just made you want to smile and made you want to sing along with it. You remember what it was? Don't worry, be happy. That's right. And as I say, it just made you want to smile, and in that sense it was helpful. But the thing is, if you look at the lyrics, they don't really offer much help. I mean, they just kind of acknowledge the fact that life doesn't always go exactly the way that you want it to go. But hey, don't worry, be happy. Nice sentiment, but sort of shallow, don't you think? Again, that's not what Jesus is doing here. Jesus knew that the people then and people today live in the real world. He knew that they were real people who had real responsibilities, caring for their children, a mortgage that was due, bills that had to be paid, and employers who expected results. He knew that there is a kind of concern for every day that is not only normal, but actually healthy. But Jesus also knew that too often people borrow trouble from the future. That is, when they're looking into the future, instead of assuming the best, they fear the worst. And they start asking all sorts of what-if questions. What if I fail? What if the job doesn't work out? What if someone I love gets sick? What if the economy goes south? And on and on and on with the what-ifs. And Jesus knew that the moment you start down that road of asking what-ifs, then you're well on your way to destroying the very joy and peace and contentment that we all seek. And so Jesus instead said, don't borrow trouble from the future. Instead, he invited us to try looking at the future from a different perspective. He invited us to look at the future from the perspective of a God whose love runs so deep for you and me that there is never a moment, did you hear it? Never a moment when you are beyond God's care or God's provision for your life. And the way he gets at this is by saying, look at the birds of the air. Consider the lilies of the field. Tom Long, the well-known preacher, teacher, and theologian, points out that those two words, look and consider, in the Greek, are active verbs. That is, they're meant to imply more than a casual glance. They're meant to imply that we're to really look at the world around us and see how God cares for everything, how God makes provision for everything. The birds of the air, the lilies of the field, the fish of the sea, everything. A few years ago, my wife Carol and I put together a couple of birthday gifts and an anniversary gift, and we took one of those bucket list trips that you sometimes take. We went out to Alaska. And while we were in Seward, Alaska, we went out on one of the whaling boats. Those are the boats that you take out and they go out to areas where it's common to see whales. And on the day that we were there, we saw the most amazing sight. We saw a large school of humpback whales. In fact, several large schools of humpback whales had traveled north into that area and were in the middle of a feeding frenzy. Now, humpback whales are not the largest mammals on the planet, but they are maybe the second largest mammal on the planet. They weigh like 80 tons, and they are like 60 feet long. And sometimes you'll see these feeding frenzies of humpback whales, but it's usually a lot further south. But on this occasion, they had traveled north, and the captain of our boat was so excited because this was the first time she'd seen anything like this in like 10 years or more. And here's sort of the way it works. About 10 or 15 of these humpback whales will all come to the surface at the same time, and they'll take a deep breath, and all of a sudden they'll dive and they'll just disappear beneath the water. And the matriarch humpback whale in the school will go even deeper, and she'll get down in between them, and they'll form sort of a circle, and then all of a sudden she'll blow up all of these bubbles. And when all of these bubbles come up, then the smaller fish that are in that area will move towards the center of the bubbles. And when they do that, all of a sudden you see all 10 or 15 of these humpback whales break the surface, and they'll open their mouths, and voila, lunch has been served. It's not such a good deal for the smaller fish, but the humpback whales enjoy the meal. Now here's the point. How do these humpback whales know to do that? How do the birds know how to fly? How do the lilies know when it's time to burst into bloom? Because God cares for them and has made provision for every single one of them. And God says, Jesus says, if God will do that for them, think what he will do for you. You're just a little lower than the angels, says the psalmist. You're created in the image of God, says the writer of the book of Genesis. Think what God will do for you. Now, Jesus isn't saying here, and I don't want to mislead you, he's not saying that you won't have trouble in life. You will have trouble in life. At least almost everybody I know has had some trouble in their lives because that's the nature of the world that we live in. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes the economy goes south. Sometimes the job doesn't work out the way you want it to. But listen to what Jesus says when those sorts of things happen. In the world, he says, you will have distress. But be encouraged. I've conquered the world. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in me? You believe in God? Believe also in me. I will not leave you. I will come to you. Listen to the witness of others in the pages of the Bible. God is our refuge and strength, said the psalmist, a very present help in trouble. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? What then shall we say to these things, said Paul? If God is for us, who can be against us? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? No. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Now, what's the point? What's Jesus saying here? Jesus is saying that no matter what happens to us in life, God's grace is sufficient for us. He's saying that even in times of trouble, we don't need to be afraid because God is already out there ahead of us, caring for us and making provision for us. At our home, we have a dog by the name of Boone. Boone is this beautiful black lab, and he's been with us now for 12 years, and Boone is about as good a pet as you can possibly find. Not much of a hunting dog, but he's a good pet. And he's loving. When I'm studying, he'll lie docilely at my feet. And when I'm not feeling well, he'll nuzzle up next to me and try to comfort me in whatever way he knows how. But as Carol often tells people, Boone is also kind of an odd dog. Now, I actually think Boone knows what Carol's saying, because he doesn't do those same things for Carol that he does for me. But Carol's right. Because often when Boone is walking from one room into another room and he'll get to the door frame, all of a sudden he'll just turn around and he'll kind of back out the door like this, making sure that nobody sneaks up behind him. And if he's in another part of the house and he wants to get to where you are, he'll just stand there and cry. For no reason. He'll just stand there and cry. And when you go to take him out, you normally open the door and the dogs go. Boone waits for us to go outside first. Just wants to make sure it's all going to be okay. However, there are 3 words that I can say to Boone that change everything. It's just sort of occurred over a number of years, but there are 3 words that I can say that'll change everything. He will walk out the door face first, he'll go out ahead of us, and he'll move from one part of the house to another part of the house. Anybody want to guess what those 3 words are? No, it's not want a treat. The 3 words are this: I've got you. Boone, I've got you. And there's something about my voice that assures him that I'm beside him and that I'm going to make provision for him. And what Jesus says to you and what Jesus says to me is, I've got you. I've got you no matter what. So, Jesus says, don't worry. Take a lesson from nature. And instead of borrowing trouble from the future, try seeing your struggles from the perspective of a God whose love for you runs so deep that there is never a moment when you are beyond God's care or God's provision. And when you do that, then you're able to live, really live in the present with joy and peace and contentment. So here's how I want to end. I want to invite you to pray with me. But as we bow together for a moment, I want you first of all to just get in your mind one thing. Now some of you, the struggle is going to be limiting down to one thing. But just put your mind on one thing that you're worried about, okay? So let's bow together and just for a moment, concentrate on that one thing. Now I want you to imagine that Jesus is sitting right next to you right now, which he is. And I want you to listen to him as he says, this thing you're worried about, I've got you. I've got you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We're going to sing our closing hymn now, and as we sing our closing hymn, and when we do, we're going to stand. Don't stand yet. And I want to open the doors of the church this morning. If there's anyone here this morning who would like to join this church, whether by a profession of your faith or a transfer of your membership. So will you stand as together we sing?